The image that comes back to me first isn't a face, it's a table. A scarred wooden tabletop under humming fluorescent lights with a small pile of objects laid out like they'd been arranged for a photograph. There was a pack there, faded green canvas still damp in spots, smelling faintly of river water and mildew. Beside it, a swollen paperback with the pages puffed out like lungs mid-breath and a cheap plastic whistle that had left a rust-colored ring on the paper beneath it. A folded map, its creases gone soft, rested near the edge, and in the middle of everything sat a little yellow camera cloudy window, staring up like an eye that had seen too much. The room around us was cold, the kind of cold that leaks from cinder block walls and metal chairs, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been: the scrape of a chair leg, the buzz of an overhead light, the dry swallow in my own throat. Someone shifted behind me, boots on linoleum, but nobody spoke. We all just watched that small, ordinary pile of things, knowing on some level that they carried more weight than any words in the room. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I grew up in a place where you could hear the town waking up long before you saw it. In Pine Hollow, summer mornings started with the low growl of pickup trucks rolling down the hill toward the plant, the whine of a distant lawn mower, and the hollow clap of a screen door slamming somewhere down the block. The air smelled like cut grass and hot asphalt by mid-morning, and by noon the heat settled in the streets like a thick blanket pressing the cicadas into their steady electric song. You didn't need a clock to know the time of day back then. You could hear it in the rhythm of tires over the bridge grates and the way the shadows from the maple trees slipped across the Doyle's front porch. My own days that summer were flipped from most folks. I slept with the curtains drawn against the white glare of late morning, a box fan rattling in the window, pushing warm air over me and stirring the smell of old coffee that lingered in my little rental. By late afternoon, I'd be pulling on my maroon diner uniform and white sneakers, the fabric already faintly scented with fryer grease and dish soap, and I'd drive the two-lane road into town with the windows down. The radio crackled between stations if you went too close to the hills, so most evenings I just listened to the hum of my engine and the rasp of tires on the patched blacktop, the sky above the ridge turning from bright blue to that softer, hazier kind of light that makes everything look a little more forgiving. The diner sat just off the highway, a low-slung building with a metal roof that pinged when the first raindrops hit it. Inside, it smelled like bacon coffee and lemon cleaner, the kind of scent that soaked into your hair and clothes and followed you home. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving everything a faint hum, and the jukebox in the corner clicked and thunked even when no one was feeding it quarters. The regulars knew my name by heart, and I knew what they drank before they hit the booth: black coffee and chipped white mugs for the plant guys, sweet tea over too much ice for the nurses finishing their shifts, a chocolate milkshake for whichever high school kid had snuck out after curfew. That was the world Hannah kept stepping in and out of that summer. She'd push open the glass door in the late afternoon light, the bell over it giving a tired little ring, and the cooler air inside would brush past her like a welcome. I can still hear the squeak of her sneakers on the tile when she crossed to her booth back left under the window where you could see the hills if you leaned enough. She'd drop her backpack onto the seat back. Then it was just a faded red school pack, not the green one that would come later, and slide in with a soft sigh, elbows on the table, fingers tracing rings in the condensation from her soda. Hannah was one of those people who never quite sat still, even when she looked relaxed. At 21, she had the face of someone younger and the eyes of someone older, brown and thoughtful, always drifting to the window like part of her mind was already halfway up the ridge. She wore the same denim jacket most days, even in the heat, the collar softened from years of tugging it up against the wind. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands sticking to the nape of her neck when the air grew thick and heavy. If you watched closely, you could see how her knee bounced under the table whenever she started talking about school or about getting out of town for a while, like her body was already moving ahead of her. We'd known each other since we were kids, sitting cross-legged on the elementary school lawn, trading half-warm juice boxes and comparing scraped knees. I was the one who stayed in Pine Hollow after graduation, taking whatever jobs I could find and learning the town from the inside out. She was the one who'd gotten out at least partway a state college a few hours down the road, dorm rooms and lecture halls, professors who talked about places most of us had only seen on TV. When she came home for breaks, she'd bring that world with her in small ways, stories about campus protests, new bands we'd never heard of, pamphlets from the outdoor club she'd joined, smudged with fingerprints and coffee stains. That particular summer, though, something in her felt different. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was more like a slight change in key that you don't notice until you hear an old song played again. She sat quieter some days, her soda straw drifting in slow circles through melting ice while she stared past my shoulder at the line of hills outside. She'd still laugh when the line cooks cracked a joke or when I complained about the coffee machine acting up again, but sometimes her laughter came a second late, as if it had to catch up to her. When she talked about going back to school in the fall, there was a thin, tight note under her words, the kind that made me think of guitar strings tuned just a little too high. I remember one evening in June when the heat had finally broken and the air felt almost soft again. The sun was sliding down behind the ridge, casting a pale orange light through the diner windows and turning the chrome on the napkin holders into little streaks of fire. The highway outside was quieter than usual, just the occasional whoosh of a car heading toward the state line. Hannah sat in her booth with a folded county map spread out in front of her, smoothing the corners with the flat of her hand. The paper made a faint crackling sound under her fingers. "What are you looking at so hard?" I asked, balancing a pot of coffee in one hand, the handle warm against my palm. "Just trails," she said, not looking up right away. Her voice was soft but steady. "Remember that lake my dad used to take us to out past Ridgeview? There's a campground there. I was thinking about going up for a weekend. Just getting away from everything for a couple days." As she spoke, she traced a faint loop that ran around the blue smudge of the lake, her fingertip leaving a tiny line of skin oil on the map. I could smell the coffee between us, dark and bitter, mixing with the fry oil and pie crust in the air. Somewhere in the back, the dish sprayer hissed and clattered, and a country song hummed low from the jukebox, almost drowned out by the drone of the air conditioner. Hannah's parents. The Doyles lived in a small white house with peeling trim on a quiet street just off the main road. Their front porch sagged a little in the middle, and the steps creaked under your feet. But in the evenings, it always felt like the safest spot in town. On nights when I wasn't working late, I'd sometimes sit out there with them sipping sweet tea and listening to the low murmur of their voices as fireflies blinked on and off in the yard. The porch light cast a wide circle of yellow on the worn floorboards, and beyond that the darkness pressed close and soft, filled with the sound of crickets and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Karen kept flower boxes on the railings, petunias and geraniums spilling over in reds and purples, and the mingled smell of damp soil and laundry soap drifted out from the screen door. Daniel usually sat in the same chair near the steps, jeans still dusty from the plant, his hands wrapped around a sweating glass. He wasn't a talkative man, but when he spoke, it was with a quiet certainty that made people lean in to listen. Hannah tended to perch sideways on the porch swing barefoot, one leg tucked under her, the other swinging slow arcs just above the splintered boards. That June, more than once, I caught the way Karen's eyes lingered on her daughter when the conversation turned to hiking or to those hills that wrapped around us. One evening, while the sky was still streaked with pink and the air smelled of charcoal from someone's backyard grill, Hannah mentioned wanting to camp alone for a night or two just to clear her head. The pause that followed her words was small, but I heard it. The cicadas outside buzzed on relentless, but in that pause, the sound seemed to float a little farther away. "By yourself?" Karen asked, her thumb tightening on the rim of her glass. "I've been up there a dozen times, Mom." Hannah said, her tone easy. "The campground's practically in our backyard. I just want some quiet before everything starts back up again." Daniel's chair creaked as he shifted, looking past the yard toward the dark line of trees beyond the street. The porch light clicked on with a faint pop as the dusk deepened, the bulb humming softly. "You'll take your phone," he said after a moment, "and you'll tell us exactly where you're staying." "I will," she answered with that little half-smile she used when she wanted to assure everyone all at once. "2 nights, that's all. I'll be back before you even miss me." Back then, the phones we carried were chunky things that lived at the bottom of purses and glove compartments, more novelty than necessity. Service out by the lake was patchy at best, but it made parents feel better just to know the device existed, a plastic lifeline in a world that still belonged more to landlines and payphones. I remember Hannah flipping her little gray handset open and shut absent-mindedly as we sat on that porch, the plastic clicking softly in the warm air, catching the glow from the porch light each time she moved her hand. As the weekend she'd picked grew closer, life in Pine Hollow went on the way it always did. The plant whistle still blew at 7, the post office door still banged every time someone went in for their mail, and the same old men still gathered on the bench outside the hardware store to watch the world go by. In the afternoons, heat shimmered above the blacktop, and the hills wore a blue haze like a thin veil. By evening, the smell of cut hay and wood smoke curled through the valley, and the sky turned that deep, dusky blue that makes every porch light look brighter than it is. At the diner, the regulars talked about nothing and everything: yard sales, gas prices, a rumor about new management at the plant. Hannah came by with a list crumpled in her hand one night: canned soup trail mix, a new flashlight, extra batteries. She slid into her usual booth and spread the list out flat, pressing it with her palm, the paper making a faint whispering sound. I watched her chew on the end of her straw as she talked about how she was only going for 2 nights, how she knew the trails like the back of her hand, how she just wanted to sleep under the stars and listen to the water lapping at the shore. "You'll send me a picture?" I said, nodding toward the disposable camera she'd bought from the rack by the register. It was one of those yellow ones in crinkly plastic, the kind that clicked and whirred when you wound the film. "I'll send you 10. She laughed, the sound light and easy, the laughter bouncing off the stainless steel counter behind me. "You'll be sick of trees by the time I'm done." Later that night, when my shift finally slowed and the coffee pot sat half empty and cooling on the warm plates, she walked me outside to my car. The air had cooled, but it still held the day's warmth in the concrete and in the metal of the car doors. Crickets chirped from the weeded edges of the parking lot, and the highway hummed with the occasional rush of a passing semi-headlight streaking white across the asphalt. She stood there in the glow from the diner's neon sign, the red letters buzzing quietly, her face washed in a strange mix of pink and white light. "I'll swing by tomorrow before I head out," she said, shifting her weight, the gravel crunching under her sneaker. "Grab a soda for the road. Text me when you get there," I replied, fishing my keys from my pocket, the metal cool against my fingers. "Even if the signal's garbage, just try. I'll be up anyway." She rolled her eyes in that mock exasperated way she had, but there was softness behind it. "Yes, Mom," she said, smiling. Then she stepped back, lifted a hand in a small wave, and turned toward her car. I watched her taillights glow red as she backed out, then grow smaller as she pulled onto the road and headed toward town. The sound of her engine faded into the thick summer night, swallowed by the hum of insects and the low sigh of wind coming down off the ridge. For a long moment after she'd gone, the parking lot felt too quiet, the air too still. The neon sign crackled. The ice machine shuddered once from inside the building, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice and then stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just another July night, another friend heading home, another weekend on the horizon. I locked my car, glanced once more at the empty stretch of highway, and tried not to notice how the dark beyond the diner windows seemed to press in a little closer than usual as if it were waiting for something none of us could yet name. The shift from normal to wrong didn't happen all at once. It came as a small tremor at first, something I brushed aside because it didn't look like trouble, not in the way you expect danger to look. I remember standing behind the counter at the diner that Saturday afternoon, the hum of the milkshake machine in the background and the faint smell of fried onions hanging in the warm air when I realized my phone hadn't buzzed. I didn't think much of it. The signal up near Ridgeview Lake was spotty on the best of days. Still, I found myself checking the little screen twice, then a third time waiting for the message Hannah had promised made it safe. By early evening, the dinner crowd rolled in boots, scuffing across the tile silverware, clattering against plates, a low chorus of voices filling the room. The noise should have drowned everything else out, but I felt a tiny pulse of attention pinned to my pocket, waiting for something that didn't come. When I called her around 7 just to nudge her, the call jumped straight to voicemail. That wasn't like her, not even out in the woods. Usually it rang a few times before the signal cut. This time it was instant. A hollow click, followed by that recorded voice telling me to try again later. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she'd turned the phone off to save the battery. Maybe she'd left it in the car while she walked the trail. There were simple explanations, common sense ones, and I clung to them the way you hold a cup by the rim when it's too hot. Customers kept me busy, and by the time I clocked out around 10, the worry had shrunk into something smaller, just an itch I could scratch later. Outside, the night was warm, the kind that carries the last traces of daylight in the air long after the sun is gone. A breeze rattled the metal sign near the highway, and the smell of distant campfire wood smoke drifted down from somewhere up the ridge. I leaned against my car and tried her number again, straight to voicemail. I listened to the sound of trucks passing on the highway, the steady rumble fading into the trees, and I felt a little knot tighten in my chest. On my drive home, the hills were dark silhouettes against a sky that still held a faint smear of blue. My headlights brushed the edges of tall grass, and every time they caught a shape, an old stump, a mailbox, I felt myself brace, waiting for something to be there that wasn't. I rolled down the window halfway, letting the cool air wash into the car, hoping it would quiet the strange jitter I couldn't shake. When I turned onto Maple Ridge Road, the Doyle house was lit up like usual, the porch light steady a warm little beacon in the dark. Somehow seeing that light made the worry feel less foolish. If something were wrong, surely they would have called. I parked in front of my place, the gravel popping under my tires, and made one more attempt to reach her. Same result. I stared at the screen until it went black, then set the phone on the kitchen table and tried to go about my night washing a few dishes, filling the water pitcher, flipping through channels that all looked the same. But every few minutes my eyes drifted back to that phone. The silence around me thickened in a way I couldn't name. The next morning I woke too early with sunlight spilling through the curtains, laying a hot stripe across my bed. For a moment I forgot why my heart felt heavy, but then I saw the phone on my nightstand and everything rushed back. I sat up and called her again and again. The call died before it even rang. I didn't like the feeling that settled over me then. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was more like that moment when you're sure you left something burning on the stove but can't quite remember. A slow, creeping wrongness. I tried to tell myself she'd slept in. Maybe she'd gone for an early hike and left the phone behind. Maybe she'd packed up and headed home before dawn. There were so many ways the day could still make sense. By late morning, the sky had clouded over the kind of low gray that makes the hills look closer than they are. I drove to the Doyle house because it felt better to be with someone else than to sit alone with my thoughts. When Karen opened the door, she had a phone in her hand. That was my first real jolt. She wasn't usually the type to carry it around the house. "Have you heard from her?" she asked before I even stepped inside. Her voice was steady, but her eyes moved in quick little motions, scanning my face like she already knew the answer. "No," I said. I figured maybe she got busy or ran out of signal. She was supposed to call this morning, Karen said, stepping back so I could come in. Just a quick check-in. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, elbows on his knees, leaning forward with his hands clasped. That posture alone made my stomach drop. He wasn't the sort of man who telegraphed worry, and seeing him that way told me the situation had already shifted from odd to wrong in his mind. She said 2 nights, he muttered, not looking up. But she always checks in. We tried calling again. Karen held the phone to her ear, the cord of the charger stretched taut across the counter, though the battery was already full. She waited, eyes fixed on the far window, listening to the same abrupt click I'd heard all night. When she lowered the phone, she didn't bother to hide the tremor in her hand. I suggested we drive out to the lake. Just to ease everyone's mind, I told myself, though, beneath that thin layer of logic, dread had already started to seep through. The drive felt longer than it ever had before. The air smelled like wet leaves, and the promise of rain, and the trees leaned over the road, their branches whispering against each other in the wind. No one spoke much. Even the old radio just hissed when we tried to find a station. When we reached the lake, the parking area was mostly empty except for an old hatchback and a pickup that looked like it had been there for days. Hannah's car wasn't among them. That surprised me more than it should have. I think part of me had expected to see it right there, the familiar shape of it instantly dissolving every worry. Instead, the empty gravel lot looked like an accusation. We followed the path down to the shoreline. The lake was calm, a wide gray mirror, broken only by a stray ripple near the far bank. The air smelled of moss and that faint metallic tang lakes sometimes have before a storm. When we reached the campground, I felt something cold slide through me, though the air itself was warm and still. Her tent was there, small, green, perfectly pitched. The sight of it made everything inside me fall silent, as if my thoughts themselves had been cut short. It stood exactly the way she would have left it if she'd stepped away for just a moment. Zipper closed, stakes straight, the little tarp pulled taut over the top. A book lay on the picnic table beside it, the pages curled at the corners from the damp air, open to the middle like she'd been reading, and set it down mid-sentence. Her camp stove sat on the table, too, the metal cool and untouched with the pot still resting upside down beside it. A half-used can of soup sat near her pack of matches. Everything was neat, familiar, ordinary, except she wasn't there. I didn't call out at first. None of us did. There was something about the quiet around that tent that made speaking feel wrong, like raising your voice in a church when you're alone. The woods pressed close around us, tall and dark, the branches swallowing what little breeze there was. I stepped closer to the tent and touched the nylon. It felt cool under my fingers, smooth and thin, the fabric barely giving beneath my touch. The zipper hung straight, no sign of it being tugged or forced. Maybe she went for a walk, I whispered, though my eyes were already searching the ground around us. The dirt was dry, soft enough to show prints, but I didn't see anything beyond our own. Daniel circled the site slowly, his boots scuffing leaves, his face tight. He called her name once, quiet, almost tentative, but the sound barely made it past the first row of trees. Karen didn't move from the table. She had her hand on the book, fingers resting lightly on the pages, as if they might tell her something she'd missed. I could hear her breathing slow and shaky, like each breath had to be coached into her chest. I walked toward the shoreline just a few yards away. The water lapped softly against the rocks, a rhythmic sound that felt too calm for what was happening in my chest. I kept expecting to see her sitting on one of the big stones near the bank legs, pulled up, staring at the lake the way she always did. But there was nothing. No footprints, no gear, no sign she'd ever made it past the tent. When I came back to the campsite, the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the woods themselves were leaning in. I told myself she might have wandered farther down the trail, lost track of time. Maybe her phone had died. All the explanations spun through my mind, flimsy as dry leaves, but I still gathered them up and stacked them neatly, desperate for any scenario that didn't end in the one possibility none of us wanted to speak aloud. As the minutes stretched, the silence settled deeper. No birds, no distant voices, just the faint creak of branches shifting overhead. I realized then that the sun had drifted lower behind the ridge, and a long shadow had crept across the campsite, reaching toward the tent like a slow-moving tide. The air had cooled enough that I could feel a thin, damp chill settle against the back of my neck. Karen finally lifted her head and looked at her husband with a quiet urgency that made my stomach twist. Daniel pressed his lips together, nodding once, and reached into his pocket for the keys. He didn't have to say anything. We all knew what that nod meant. We began walking back toward the cars, none of us wanting to be the first to turn our backs completely on the sight. The leaves rustled under our feet, the sound strangely loud in the stillness. When we reached the lot again, I saw a dust cloud rising far down the road, illuminated by the fading light. As it drew closer, the shape of a sheriff's cruiser came into view, its headlights cutting through the dimness, bouncing across the ruts and the gravel. I stood there with my hand resting on the door of my car, the cool metal grounding me for a moment, and watched the cruiser roll to a slow stop. The engine idled low and steady. The deputy stepped out, closed the door softly, and took off his hat before walking toward us. And that was the moment the last of my explanations fell quiet inside me. The moment when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what none of us were ready to hear. The search began before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, the air still holding the coolness of night and the faint smell of damp leaves. I remember standing at the edge of the Doyle driveway with my arms wrapped tight around myself, watching the sheriff's cruiser idle at the curb while a deputy spoke quietly with Daniel. The red and blue lights weren't flashing, but the cruiser's engine made a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate up through the gravel. Karen stood near the porch steps, fingers gripping the railing hard enough to turn her knuckles pale, her thin summer sweater pulled close around her as though the morning chill had teeth. The deputy, an older man named Rowden, quiet and methodical, tipped his hat to me when our eyes met, and there was something in that small gesture that told me we'd crossed a line. This wasn't a matter of a late check-in or a dead phone anymore. Whatever we were stepping into had its own weight, and we were only just beginning to feel it. The moment that realization settled, I felt the same kind of slow sinking I've only ever felt once or twice in my life, like the ground beneath us had softened without warning. We followed the cruiser back toward the lake, our vehicles spaced out along the twisting road. The morning light filtered through the trees in thin beams that flickered across the windshield, and with each turn the sense of dread grew heavier. When we reached the campground, several more sheriff's trucks were already parked in a rough line, their doors standing open, radios hissing and spitting static into the stillness. A pair of state park rangers stood near the shoreline, their uniforms dark against the silver-blue water. Someone had put a large map across the hood of a truck, its corners pinned down with flashlights and a thermos. I watched as the sheriff traced his finger along the lake loop. His brow pinched, his lips pressed into a thin line. Dogs barked from the back of an SUV, restless, their nails tapping against the metal floor. Rowden lifted a crate of gear from the truck bed, a handful of bright orange vests, coils of rope radios that crackled like they were clearing their throats, and laid them out with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times, but never lightly. The sight of that organized preparation, the sense of the search widening beyond the three of us who had stood in the woods the afternoon before, pulled something tight inside my chest. It made everything feel real in a way that words couldn't touch. I felt the cold morning air slip down inside my collar as we approached the tent again, the nylon fluttering faintly in the wind that skimmed off the lake. A ranger crouched beside the tent-gloved fingers, sifting the dirt. He moved carefully, brushing aside leaves, pausing every so often to lean closer to the ground. "Nothing fresh beyond your prints," he said quietly when the sheriff approached. His voice carried that mix of professionalism and regret that I would come to recognize over the next days. A search dog circled the site, its leash pulled taut as it nosed around the table, then the tent entrance, then back again, whining softly each time it lost the thread. The handler murmured encouragement, but I could hear the frustration in his tone. The dog froze for a moment near the edge of the clearing where the trees closed in, then gave a short, high sound before circling back toward its handler. Whatever scent it had found, it didn't last long. I stood nearby, feeling the damp earth seep through the soles of my sneakers. The smell of wet pine needles rose with every step I took. The tent, still zipped and perfectly staked, seemed almost defiant in its stillness, like it refused to give anything away. The paperback on the table had swollen even more from the night moisture, the ink on the page bleeding just enough to blur a few words. I stared at it far longer than I intended, as if it held an answer. By mid-morning, volunteers began arriving. Some were fishermen from the lake, their boots still slick with mud. Others were folks from town farmers' retirees, a couple of high schoolers who'd come with their parents, most of them carrying backpacks, water bottles, or old handheld radios. They gathered near the ranger truck, listening quietly as instructions were given. Follow the marked trails, check ravines keep within shouting distance, and report anything that didn't belong. The sound of boots crunching along the dried pine needles echoed through the woods as the first teams headed out. I joined a group moving along the lake's western trail, the dirt packed smooth and cool beneath our feet. The woods smelled of moss and wet bark, the morning sun filtering through branches in thin, slanted beams. A squirrel darted across the path, its sudden movement startling enough to make one of the volunteers suck in a sharp breath. Nobody laughed. We walked slowly, scanning the ground, glancing into thickets where shadows pooled. A ranger pointed out where rain runoff had carved narrow channels in the soil, the edges still soft and dark. For a brief, breathless moment, I saw what looked like a partial footprint near one of the runoff paths. My heart kicked hard, but as the ranger crouched to inspect it, he shook his head. Wrong size, wrong shoe tread, likely a hiker from days before. My moment of hope collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen, leaving me with the cold ache of disappointment. Farther along, we checked a small ravine that cut down toward the water. The rocks there were slick with moss, and the air felt cooler, almost clammy. A couple of volunteers climbed down with ropes, their voices drifting up in low, steady bursts. When they reappeared minutes later, shaking their heads, I felt the weight of their silence more than the words themselves. By noon, the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the last of the morning mist, leaving the woods warmer and brighter. The heat brought out the scent of sap and the dry tang of dust along the trail. Helicopter blades thumped in the distance, growing louder until the machine rose above the tree line, drifting toward the far side of the lake. We shielded our eyes as it circled the sun, glinting off the metal belly. Watching it hover above those dense hills, I felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. Hope that something might finally make itself known, dread that maybe it wouldn't. When we returned to the main clearing for water, the sheriff and a few deputies stood over the map again. More lines had been drawn, loops, arrows, shaded regions. Everything looked methodical, almost clinical, but the tension in their shoulders betrayed the urgency beneath it. One deputy rubbed the back of his neck, eyes narrowed at the map. Another kept glancing toward the tent, jaw tight. Rumors had already begun slipping through the volunteer groups, moving quiet as wind through branches. Someone mentioned a stranger seen near the bait shop earlier that week. Someone else whispered about hunters camping farther up the ridge. A group of teenagers claimed they'd heard something strange 2 nights before, what exactly they couldn't agree on. Every theory contradicted the next, each one dissolving as soon as someone pressed for details. In town, I knew the stories would already be spreading. Pine Hollow wasn't a place where news stayed put. Shopkeepers would be talking, church groups murmuring together in low clusters, neighbors checking their yards a little more closely as the evening drew near. But up at the lake, all that noise was replaced by a heavier quiet, the kind that fills the gaps when fear begins to settle. As the day wore on, the search widened. Teams fanned out in long lines through brush thick enough to catch on clothing. Radios crackled with faint broken updates. Trail clear. No sign here. Checking the ridge now. Rangers scanned the ground for any hint of disturbance, a broken branch, a scrap of clothing, the imprint of a heel. But nothing held. Every trace we found belonged to someone else some other day. The woods refused to give us even the smallest thread to pull. At one point, a volunteer called out holding something up between two fingers. The way he stood there, back straight, arm lifted, with a kind of tense hesitation, made my breath snag. When he stepped closer, I saw it was a piece of fabric red torn at the edge, dusty from the trail. My pulse jumped until the ranger took it gently from him, turned it over and shook his head. Wrong color, wrong size. It wasn't hers. Relief and frustration tangled inside me, both sharp and hollowing. By late afternoon, fatigue set in. The air had grown heavy with humidity thick enough that sweat clung to the back of my neck and soaked through the collar of my shirt. The forest seemed to close in more tightly with each passing hour, the shadows between the trees stretching longer and darker as the sun dipped lower. My legs ached from climbing over roots and downed branches. My throat felt raw from calling her name. Still, I couldn't make myself stop. Each new area we checked felt like another chance to find her, and each one we cleared left me more unmoored. I kept replaying that small, ordinary tent in my mind, the zipper straight, the book open, everything arranged just so. It didn't add up. It didn't even come close. As evening slipped in, the sheriff called everyone back to the clearing. The sky was fading into that soft, muted gold that comes just before dusk, and the lake reflected the light in long, shimmering streaks. A few dragonflies skimmed low over the surface, their wings catching the last of the sun. The air smelled of cooling earth and lake water, that unmistakable blend of mineral and moss. People gathered slowly, boots dragging shoulders hunched. The day had taken something out of all of us. The sheriff's radio crackled again, a voice saying something too faint to make out. He pressed the button, answered quietly, then stepped away for a moment. When he returned, he spoke with the deputies in low-clipped tones. Their expressions shifted, not relief, not exactly alarm, but something in between, a kind of sharpened focus. I stood beside Karen, who had barely spoken all day. She kept her hands clasped tightly against her chest, her fingertips pressed to her lips. Daniel stood close behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his thumb rubbing a slow, unconscious circle through the fabric of her sweater. The cicadas had begun their evening chorus, a buzzing wall of sound that made the conversations around us feel muffled and far away. Then I noticed a young deputy walking toward the sheriff's truck, something small held carefully in his gloved hand. He didn't call out. He didn't hurry. But the way he cradled that object, delicate, deliberate, made my breath freeze in my throat. The sheriff met him halfway, spoke quietly, then lifted his gaze toward the tree line as if seeing it with new eyes. A low breeze stirred the leaves, carrying a faint scent of rain. The shadows around us deepened, stretching across the clearing like long, dark fingers. The murmurs among the volunteers fell quiet one by one until the only sound left was the steady hum of the woods settling into night. And in that stillness I realized something had shifted. Not the end of the search, not the answer, not yet. But the first sign that whatever waited ahead of us wouldn't be simple and wouldn't be kind. It was a long stretch of years before anything surfaced, the kind of years that wear grooves into a person. By the time the call finally came, I'd learned to keep my phone on the nightstand, even when I stopped waiting for good news. That morning in late summer, the air was thick and warm, full of the cicadas droning when the sheriff's office rang. The voice on the other end was steady, but carried a tremor just beneath it, like someone holding their breath. I didn't catch every word, just enough to know something had shifted, something big enough that they didn't want to say it over the line. When I reached the sheriff's office, the parking lot was already crowded. A few unmarked cars I recognized, and a couple I didn't. The air smelled faintly of river mud, like someone had carried the scent in on their clothes. Inside, everything felt too bright. The overhead lights flickered weakly as if the room itself wasn't sure it wanted to be awake. Deputies moved around quietly, talking in short-clipped tones. A damp nylon pack sat on the center table, resting on a sheet of plastic. Even from the doorway, I saw its faded green color beneath the streaks of mud, the fabric crumpled like it had spent years pressed under water and stone. Someone closed the door behind me, the latch clicking softly, and the sheriff stepped forward. He didn't say a word at first. He didn't have to. The smell told its own story, earth moss and the sourness of something that had been kept in the dark for a long time. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, my hands hovering just above the edge of the plastic sheet. The pack sagged inward, misshapen, the straps stiff with dried grit. A corner of a swollen paperback peeked out from beneath the flap. The familiar shape of a small yellow camera sat off to one side, its cloudy window staring blankly upward. It took a moment before I could speak. My voice barely made it out. Where was it found? The sheriff exhaled through his nose, tired like he'd rehearsed this part too many times already. A cavern along the river, he said. Miles from the lake. Water levels rose after the storms this month and forced some debris down. 2 local kayakers found it wedged between the rocks. I felt the room tilt slightly like the floor had lost its anchor. Someone offered me a chair, but I didn't sit. My legs were trembling too much to trust them. They began laying out the items inside the pack one by one. A tin whistle rusted at the seams. A plastic poncho folded tight but cloudy from moisture. A corroded flashlight that rattled when moved, its batteries swollen. A map with faint pencil marks along the lake trail. And then the camera, the disposable one she'd picked up at the diner the week before she left. The plastic casing was warped. The label bubbled from water, but the roll of film inside had survived. They sent the camera to a lab 3 states away. For weeks we waited days, crawling forward in a kind of suspended quiet. Every time the phone rang, I felt my stomach drop, nausea tightening in my throat. When the envelope finally arrived, thick and dense with prints, the sheriff called me in again. He didn't open the packet in the main room. We went to a smaller office in the back, blinds half-drawn, the lights dimmer there. The air felt cooler, too, as if the temperature had dropped just to prepare us. The photos smelled faintly of chemicals and damp paper. The first ones were ordinary, in a heartbreaking way, a blurry shot of the lake at sunset. Golden light reflected off the still water. Another showed her tent half risen, the fabric folding in soft angles. A shot of the picnic table, her soda can, and the little phone she always kept half-charged. Then came the ones taken that night. The first night frame was almost completely dark except for the harsh white bloom of flash. It lit the nylon walls of the tent from the inside, the fabric glowing pale like a lantern stretched thin. In the center of the frame, the tent's wall pushed inward, not sharply, not jaggedly, just a soft bulge like a hand or something close to it pressing gently from the outside. 5 shapes, blurred, uneven, the kind that make your mind scramble for explanations that won't hold. The sheriff set that photo aside slowly, his fingers trembling just slightly when they left the edge. Another night photo showed the ground outside the tent. Pine needles, a scattering of dirt. 2 oval impressions where someone or something had been standing. And at the lower corner, almost invisible, was the faint line of her backpack strap. She had it with her when she left the tent. That single detail landed in my chest with a heaviness I still feel. More images followed, dark, grainy shapes smeared by movement, but none of them answered anything cleanly. Instead, they formed a mosaic of fear, each frame a fragment of what she saw or thought she saw in those final minutes. And each one deepened the sense that she hadn't been alone. Investigators brought in cavers after that, specialists who understood how water moved under the limestone hills. They spread maps across tables, tracing underground passages, explaining how storms could pull loose debris down into hidden conduits and spit it out miles away. They found evidence at a sinkhole, a scrap of green nylon snagged on a jagged spur of limestone that matched the backpack. The caver had spoken softly kindly when he explained the route. A narrow throat of rock. A pinch point no person could have squeezed through. Only objects. Only something carried by force. Yet the evidence didn't end there. A few weeks later, another team searching near an old service road uncovered a small battered phone battery wedged in the debris near a rusted culvert. The kind used in flip phones in the late 90s. It was the right model, the right size, and her phone had never been found. When the sheriff held it up between two gloved fingers, the last of my hope drained out of me. That battery had been torn loose, maybe dropped, maybe ripped and carried by flooding water into the same underground system that dragged her backpack away. Her last lifeline washed through those channels like everything else she had with her. The real revelation, the one that closed the door on all the gentler theories, came when experts digitized the film and enhanced the clearest frames. The bulge in the nylon wall, the hand-shaped pressure, took on a sharper form under digital contrast. Not her hand, not her size, a larger palm, a longer shape of wrist, and near the base of the wrist, barely visible, the faint glint of a watch crown catching the flash. Someone was standing against her tent that night, close enough to touch the fabric, close enough for her to feel it. That was the moment when the story hardened into something we could no longer soften or reinterpret. She hadn't been startled by animals. She hadn't wandered off in fear of the dark. She'd seen or sensed someone outside her tent, taken her backpack, and stepped into the night with a stranger only a few feet away. The sheriff's office went quiet for a long time after the enhancements came in. The weight of that truth filled the room like cold air leaking into a basement. You could hear people swallow. You could hear fabric shift. And I felt myself growing still inside the way people do when they realize the story they've been telling themselves for years wasn't the real one. From there, the search turned into something else. Not a rescue, not a missing persons hunt, but an attempt to trace shadows left a decade earlier. They returned to the culvert, to the drainage area, to the place where the old road had once carried loggers across the ridge. Ground-penetrating radar picked up a disturbed patch beneath the soil. Search dogs alerted near it. But when the soil was turned and sifted, only old animal bones surfaced, bleached, brittle, scattered long ago by scavengers. Nothing human. The evidence told its own story, even without a body. Someone had been near her tent. Someone larger. Someone wearing a watch. Someone close enough for their shape to be burned into the film by her flash. Lightning storms had washed away every other trace. The woods had swallowed the rest. When the site was finally secured and the last of the equipment packed away, I stood outside the sheriff's office with Karen and Daniel. The air smelled of hot pavement and the coming rain. Karen held one of the developed photos in her hand, not the frightening one, just the one of the lake at sunset. Her thumb moved slowly along the warped edge of the print the way a person might touch the corner of a photograph of someone they can't bear to let go of. Daniel kept his hand on her back, a steadying gesture that looked as worn and tired as he was. The sheriff stepped out beside us, removed his hat, and let out a long breath. Not an answer. Not closure. Just the recognition that the path ahead would be its own kind of long night. Inside, phones were already ringing, reporters beginning to circle statements being drafted. A press conference would happen within hours. Evidence would be logged. The case file, dormant for years, would be reopened with new urgency. I stood there on the curb as a cool wind swept down from the ridge carrying the scent of river water and wet stone. The sky above us darkened to a deep gray heavy with rain, and I felt myself breathing in slowly, trying to steady what was left of me. Whatever came next, none of us could turn back from what had been found. The truth was no longer something we feared might be out there. It was something we'd held in our hands. The hours after the discovery moved in a slow, suspended haze, as if the world around us had shifted into a lower gear. I remember standing just outside the sheriff's office, the concrete still warm beneath my shoes, even as a thin wind came down off the ridge and raised goosebumps along my arms. Inside phones rang with a sharper urgency than they had in years. Deputies moved with a kind of careful purpose, their voices low, their footsteps heavy. No one said the words out loud, not the ones that mattered, but everyone wore the same look, shoulders drawn and eyes softer, as if whatever they had just seen had settled inside them for good. Karen and Daniel sat together in a private room down the hall. I didn't need to hear them to feel the heaviness pressing under that door. A chaplain had arrived, his presence quiet, respectful. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly as he waited for whatever would come next. The air near that hallway felt different, cooler, stiller, the way the air feels in the moments before a storm breaks. Once news spread through town, folks gathered in clusters at the hardware store, the gas station, the diner. No one moved quickly. People spoke with their hands tucked into their jacket pockets, heads bent slightly, voices carrying a muted dread. The only real noise came from the radio station out past the county line, where the afternoon host broke in between songs to confirm that a piece of evidence had surfaced connected to a long, cold case. He didn't name her. He didn't have to. Everyone in Pine Hollow already knew. The sheriff held a press conference the next morning in front of the municipal building. The sky was overcast, the clouds spread out like a dull gray sheet. Reporters stood with notepads poised, their breath fogging lightly in the late summer air. The sheriff's voice stayed measured and steady, even when he mentioned the camera, the recovered prints, the presence of another person outside Hannah's tent. He didn't speculate. He didn't offer neat answers. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has carried a story longer than most people can imagine. There were no arrests, no suspects matched the faint shape in those photographs. No local had been reported in the area wearing a wristwatch similar to the one suggested by the reflection on the film. Some old tips were rechecked, but time had dissolved them into shadows. Every possible lead had softened or vanished altogether, carried off by weather floods and the slow decay of memories. The case remained open, but after the discovery it belonged more to the realm of grief than investigation. Law enforcement followed every thread they could, running checks on drifters who passed through that summer, reviewing old complaints, old sightings, old rumors, but everything pointed to someone who had slipped into the woods unseen and slipped out the same way. There was no trial, no courtroom testimony, no moment where the truth was laid out for all to see. Just that small collection of objects, her backpack, her map, her camera, telling a story no one wanted to hear. The years that followed took on a quieter shape. Pine Hollow didn't return to the way it had been before, but people learned to move through their days with a little more caution, a little more softness. The lake saw fewer campers for a long while. The ranger station kept new flood markers posted. Parents became more protective, especially of the kids who liked to wander into the woods at dusk. Even the diner changed a little. Folks sat closer to the windows, maybe without realizing it, as if keeping an eye on the tree line brought some small measure of comfort. Karen stopped tending her flower boxes for a while. That porch, where we spent so many evenings, stayed empty, the swing, still the rusted chain creaking occasionally when the wind caught it. When I visited, I always heard the faint hum of the refrigerator in their kitchen, steady and lonely. Daniel kept busy yard work, small repairs, anything that gave his hands something to do. Every so often, I'd glimpse him standing at the edge of the driveway at dusk, staring toward the ridge with his arms folded across his chest. Not searching, just remembering. For me, the impact settled in places I didn't expect. Little things held on to her absence. The sound of gravel under my shoes on a hiking trail. The way a flashlight beam flickers against a tent wall. Even the creak of branches outside my bedroom window at night could pull me back in an instant. I carried that final photograph in my mind, the one with the distorted impressions outside the tent, far longer than I wanted to. It became a shape I learned to live around. Over time, people in town stopped talking about suspects and started talking about memories. The softball coach would mention how quick she was on her feet. Mrs. Wilkins from the library recalled the way she'd lean over the counter to ask about new books coming in. And every once in a while at the diner late at night, someone would bring up that weekend in the summer of '98, speaking of it like a bruise the town learned to press around. I found my own way of carrying it. Some nights after a late shift, I'd drive out toward the lake. I rarely got out of the car. I'd just sit with the windows cracked, listening to the water move gently against the rocks. The woods there have a different sound at night, less busy, more aware. Each rustle and shift of the trees feels deliberate. But there were nights when the lake sat utterly still, the surface like dark glass, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was holding everything it knew in a tight, silent grip. The years moved on. The Doyles moved once, then again, never far but far enough that the lake wasn't on their way to anything anymore. I changed jobs, made new routines, grew older in ways I didn't notice until I caught myself in the mirror. But the story didn't loosen its grip on me. It settled into the places grief usually settles in quiet moments, in the edges of familiar roads in the hush before dawn, when the world feels thinner. What remains now is a bittersweet understanding that the land itself holds stories we never fully uncover. The sinkholes, the hidden caves, the flood channels, they all shaped what we found and what we lost. And the person who stood outside her tent that night, whoever he was, is part of that landscape now too. A shadow woven into the quiet. Sometimes when I think back on everything, the moment that returns most clearly isn't the discovery or the photographs or even the tent. It's something simpler. The memory of her walking out of the diner that last night. I saw her, the neon sign glowing pink against her jacket, her smile faint and thoughtful as she waved before heading down the highway. There was a gentleness about her, then something bright just under the surface. It's that version of her I carry forward, not the fear, not the what-ifs, but the girl who wanted a weekend under the stars and believed the world was wide enough to hold her safely. The echoes of that summer linger, yes, but they've taken on a quieter shape over the years. They move like ripples across the lake at dusk, subtle, persistent part of the landscape now. And when I stand near the water's edge, listening to the soft lap of the waves, I can feel those echoes settling around me like a long, tired exhale. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.